All right. Hello to everyone who's joined us. Thank you so much for being here. Happy June 7th. Wonderful that you could be here with us today. We're going to give we'll give people another 2 minutes to get in because, like real life, people are late to meetings, including on Zoom. So very grateful that you all are here. Feel free to hop in the chat and say where you're from. We'd love to see where everybody's hailing from. We have a really great presentation today from Christina Pretorius, and we'll have a good amount of time for question and answer and cross dialogue, which we're really looking forward to. So thank you so much for your patience while we wait those extra 2 minutes to let folks come in. And that way we can all be in the room together when Christina starts. Michael, thank you for kicking it off in the chat. That's awesome. You'll love to see it, people connecting. All right, just one more minute. Thank you to folks introducing themselves. That's so awesome. One of these days, we'll be able to be in person. But I like the accessibility that Zoom offers us. It's really great. That doesn't really matter where you are, you can jump in. All right, we're at 3:02, and I'll continue to add folks as they show up. But again, I'm Sarah Robinson. I'm the Senior Project Manager here at Reaching Higher New Hampshire. So grateful that you're choosing to join us for what we're sure is the end of your day or close to it. I'm gonna let Nicole Heimark say hello. She's our Executive Director. And then we'll pass it off to Christina Pretorius, our Director of Policy.
Yes, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on a hot, steamy Monday afternoon. We appreciate your commitment to this group and for joining us this afternoon. Today, Christina's going to be walking you all through a briefing on the update on the state budget as it exits our Senate. But before we get into those details, I just want to share a few remarks around Reaching Higher. So Reaching Higher is a public education policy resource center. We report on all the happenings in our state and coming out of Concord on public education here in New Hampshire. And we really aim to engage people in the dialogue and enhance the conversations. So in terms of our agenda today, we're going to provide you an overview of the state budget process, what that process looks like, and what will be happening next. More specifically, we want to walk you through the Senate budget proposal as it was amended and passed just last week on June 3rd, 2021. And there are a handful of items that we want to detail for our participants today, from school vouchers, school funding, and higher education proposals here in New Hampshire. And then we'll conclude with an opportunity for folks to raise and ask questions in the chat. And again, by way of background, Reaching Higher New Hampshire has as one of its projects this New Hampshire Education Network. And really what we strive to create is a network here in New Hampshire for folks from all geographies of our state to all different roles of our state to really connect, gain information, and more importantly, share information among one another. This afternoon's network meeting is a little bit different or atypical to our typical network meetings, as we've decided to make this an open meeting, meaning we've opened it up beyond our network members, as we know folks are really curious and interested in hearing about the Senate budget proposal. So on that note, I'm going to propose that we pass the baton to Christina, and she's going to get into the content of why you're all here today.
Sure. Thanks so much, Nicole. I am Christina Pretorius. I am the policy director here at Reaching Higher New Hampshire. We're going to go over, as Nicole mentioned, some parts about the state budget. We are going to go pretty quickly because I do want to leave a lot of time at the end for questions. So if you have any questions as we go through anything like that, drop them in the chat. We can, and then we'll get to them at the end. There will be some space at the end that we can answer live questions and that kind of thing. And if we don't get to any, I can follow up and we'll email you the group after. So getting right on into it, the Senate did pass their version of the budget last Thursday. And just to give you a little bit of an idea of the budget process, and where we are. So it's already gone through the House phase, it's already gone through the Senate phase, and now we're really at the end stages here. So it's now in the House's hands. They will meet on Thursday to decide whether to adopt the Senate's version or if they want to go into a committee of conference. That is a small group of House members and Senate members who come together to sort of hash out the differences in opinions and that kind of thing, to have one singular bill to bring to both the Senate and the House, where all members will have a chance one more time to vote. And if all goes according to their plans, sending it to the governor for his signature, for his veto, or for him to not sign it and sort of just lapse it into law. Those are his three choices. Unlike a lot of other states, he can't pick or choose what he signs or vetoes when it comes to this bill. These bills, HB1 and HB2, he has to take them all as a package. So sometimes in other states, there might be line items, so he might not like one specific part. That doesn't happen in New Hampshire. So it's an all or nothing package. So there's been a lot of back and forth among the House, Senate, and Governor's office. And so we're really starting to see that play out. The committee of conferences are formed this Thursday. If they go that route, their final report will be due next Thursday, and then it will go back to the chambers for a vote. So we should have some answers. We'll be watching really closely. We'll keep you up to date on all of the happenings sort of as they happen. So that's an overview of the process. And we just wanted to give a little bit of context, before we really dive into what pieces the Senate has put in, what they kept. And that's the state's overall revenue picture. It is much rosier than anticipated by the House back in March. The Senate Ways and Means Committee met a couple of weeks ago, and they estimated a $500 million with a B dollar increase in revenue projections through fiscal years 2021, which we're in now, 2022 and 2023. So the Senate has had $501.4 million of extra, not extra, but an increase in revenue projections that they could put into their own budget. The Senate has earmarked those revenues for things like business tax cuts, interest and dividends tax cuts, contributions to the Senate's rainy day fund. You probably heard a lot about those kinds of programs in the news. They've been really vocal about them and really and speaking out about those. And they're also expecting a $57 million surplus in the Education Trust Fund by the end of next school year. So that's the $57 million is unless it's in statute, they can't take it out. So it's the Education Trust Fund, which is the state's piggy bank for schools, public and charter, and any other programs like the school voucher program would also draw from the Education Trust Fund if it goes through. That's anticipated at about a $57 million surplus at the end of next year. So, what are they planning to do with it in terms of education? So this is obviously only education. This is what we know best. But so the Senate added back some school funding by incorporating Senate Bill 135, which adds back about $45 million in school funding. They've saved the enhanced free or reduced lunch program that was from this year. They renamed that the relief fund. So you might see in the news talking about a relief fund. So that's about $35 million over the biennium, $17.5 million per year. plan to institute the school voucher program, which by our own estimates cost the state about $48 million over the biennium. And they're trading the targeted disparity aid for a property tax cut, a swept tax cut, and a payment to those excess swept towns, together about $115 million. They're infusing the school building aid fund with about $30 million, and they've restored 2 scholarship programs for high school students, the dual and concurrent enrollment program, and then college students through the governor's scholarship program. And so, talking more specifically about school funding, the Senate has proposed restoring about $65 million in school funding. It's this orange pie chart here right in the middle. And they do that by restoring Senate Bill 135 using that student count to calculate aid for the next year and instituting that $17.5 million relief fund. And I've seen in the papers talking about level funding. And in order to, quote, level fund our public schools, it would take at least $89 million. That is the drop that public schools are facing. So this $65 million makes up for about 3/4 of it. It does not make up the total. In order to level fund schools, it would be $89 million. And so it doesn't go all the way. There have been amendments to fully close that gap by restoring that disparity aid next year. Those proposals were killed both in committee and on the floor. There were some proposals throughout the entire process to restore that disparity aid. Those were killed. So right now we really are looking at that orange pie chart right now. And it's also, it's also worth noting that this doesn't include that swept tax cut because these numbers are only for the next school year. So that $65 million is next school year. It's not through the biennium. That $89 million is the next school year. So, we've talked quite a bit about the $89 million drop throughout the session. We've talked about a lot today. It's really important, I think, to note that 2/3 of this drop is affecting our most vulnerable communities, those with high proportions of students navigating poverty, those communities with low property tax bases. And we know from research, from talking to people, all of these kinds of things, that these communities that are facing the steepest cuts have also been hardest hit by the pandemic. They will need the most support in ensuring an inclusive recovery, and they're also likely the least to be able to make up the difference in property taxes. So if they do have a drop in funding, they're going to have a harder time making that difference up in property taxes than other communities might. So when we're talking about the drop in school funding, it's really important to note that this is affecting our more vulnerable communities the hardest. So, what's the Senate doing about this drop? They've proposed the language of Senate Bill 135, that's in the budget right now, that uses a student count from before the pandemic to calculate state aid for the next school year. So since there is that lag, there have been some things, an enrollment dip, a school meal waiver application, and the expiration of targeted aid programs that have resulted in an $89 million drop. So Senate Bill 135 accounts for the enrollment fluctuations in the school meal program waivers. They've also instituted a relief fund of $17.5 million per year based on the number of students who participate in school meal programs. I will note that it's capped at $17.5 million. It would be about $20 million if they use just the calculation, but the Senate proposal limits it to 17.5, so it's prorated there. And those two things together close about $64 million of the gap. But it is important to note that a statutory inflation increase offsets some of those losses. So every 2 years, the state adjusts the per student amount in state funding to adjust for inflation, since the state funding is intended to pay for things like salary, like supplies, all of those things, which they increase with inflation. So the state funding usually follows that at about 2% over the biennium. Every 2 years it's adjusted. And this year, it's closing about $17.8 million of the gap. So that inflationary increase is going to help to recoup some of that funding. It's not going to those inflationary costs. So, we're not level funding our schools. In fact, they're going to see about a $25 million reduction, which is closer to 35 to 40 if you want, if we're including that inflationary adjustment. Another thing to note in the Senate proposal is the hold harmless provision for 2023 funding calculations. The budget allows the New Hampshire Department of Ed to use pre-pandemic proportions to calculate 2023 funding. And this seems really technical, but I'm going to break it down a little bit more in the next slide. But I do want to emphasize that this hold harmless provision does say in consultation with the governor. It says that in the statute, which we'd really like to highlight here. All right, so talking about that hold harmless provision, backing up a minute, this school year that's ending right now, my daughter has a week left of school. So this school year right now, the federal government allowed schools to offer meals to any kid who wanted one, whether or not they qualified for free or reduced lunch, whether or not they submitted a waiver, they could give the meals. The USDA would pay for those meals and that kind of thing. So normally students would have to fill out an application to prove their income, things like that. They didn't this year. And they're extending that waiver into next year. And the New Hampshire Department of Ed is allowing schools to choose whether or not they offer that universal meals or if they want to go back to the application-based method. And so, why is this important? The application waiver for the over 6 million meals that the state provided our kids, which is just incredible. And shout out to the New Hampshire Department of Ed, all of the schools, all of the community partners who gave those meals during a pandemic, like serious shout outs. But the application waiver really mucked up the school funding formula since they rely on that count to calculate state aid. Under SB 135, the department will use the greater number of pre-pandemic and pandemic students to calculate the difference, but that's only for the next school year. And so where the waiver is extended, Senate Bill 135, that provision doesn't extend with it. The budget allows, being the operative word, the department to use a similar method to calculate it, but only in consultation with the governor. To be perfectly honest, it's an interesting choice. It's an interesting phrase. There have been other amendments that have been proposed that were more, I wouldn't say forceful, but they were more prescriptive in how the department would calculate 2023, which would give schools more certainty in their decision making. But the provision that's in the budget right now is relatively ambiguous because it says the department can use that and it's in consultation with the governor. So it's important to note, that schools are making these decisions now on whether to extend their school meal programs, what they're going to do about school meals for the next year. If they haven't already, they're going to through the summer. And this doesn't really offer them a whole lot of certainty and guidance in terms of, do they offer universal meals and ensure that all of their students have access to healthy foods? Or do they go back to the application base and ensure that their state funding is intact for the following school year? So, it really injects some uncertainty there. The language in the amendment is more ambiguous than other proposals, and it could put some schools in a difficult position when it comes to their decision making. All right, so moving on to the $100 million SWEPT reduction. You may have heard about that $100 million in property tax relief. I've seen it quite a bit in the news in the past week or so, in a lot of statements and that kind of thing. the Senate traded in the $47 million targeted disparity aid for that universal $100 million tax cut. So if you look at, your property tax bill, you'll see a state education tax, a local education tax, municipal tax, and maybe a county tax and a couple of others depending on where you live. That state education tax, that rate is being cut from $1.83, that's a rounded figure, to $1.33 in fiscal year 2023. They're relying on surplus funds to do that. So they're allowing the targeted disparity aid, which provided tax relief for towns with low property tax bases, to lapse. So that program is lapsing, no longer in effect if this version of the budget goes through, and they're implementing those cuts in the following year. And it's really significant for towns like Charlestown and Derry who are here, and similar towns that have lower property valuations and that kind of thing. So you can see here that the $1.33 will amount to a savings of $92 in Charlestown, $188 in Derry, and $257 in a place like Moulton Borough, where the average property value is much higher. In Charlestown and Derry, they're really losing big on the disparity aid where that program is lapsing. Charlestown got about $841,000. This school year, Derry got $3.4 million. Moulton Borough didn't get anything because of the size of their property tax base. So they will no longer be getting that funding. In fact, Moulton Borough will be receiving a $1.8 million supplemental payment to make up for that tax cut. So places like Moulton Borough, those excess swept towns, they're getting both a tax cut and a supplemental payment. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. And there are a couple of other quick things in the budget that we wanted to go through. It adds $30 million in school building aid. Noting, if you've been following this issue, this replaces the House's version. It's not in addition to. So that number was a little lower for the House. They had, the House chose to pay off some of the quote tail on that, some of the bond payments. This just puts $30 million into the school building aid programs. There have been 12 projects that have been approved for 2022 and 2023 for a total of $104 million out of a proposed $231 million. So $231 million of projects were proposed. They chose, based on their formula, $104 million of those projects. And I'm seeing Leslie's question about a huge supplemental payment. And I will back up, because if I don't back up now, it might be, I'd like to see the little houses here. So the supplemental payment is to make up for the excess swept. So in towns that have large property tax bases, they collect from that $1.83 more money than they would otherwise get from the New Hampshire Department of Ed in adequacy payments. So so for Moulton Borough, for example, they raise about $16,000 per student in that $1.83. They may only get $11,000 per student from the state. So that $4,000 per student, Moulton Borough retains. They don't send that back to Concord. They keep that. And so with the swept cut, that $16,000 a student might go down to $15,000 a student. And the state is paying Moulton Borough that $1,000 difference, if that makes sense. So it's not necessarily making up for past years. It's to account for the fact that the swept tax rate cut will translate to a loss in excess swept for these towns that have the larger property tax bases. So that's where the supplemental payment goes in. All right, so back to the school building aid, the 12 projects, $30 million. and Chris is right, yes, that the total budget for the 2 years of building aid is $30 million total. There have been other proposals that would have infused more money. I think Representative Mary Heath out of Manchester proposed $100 million over the biennium. That proposal was killed, and they went with the $30 million for the biennium. In terms of scholarship programs, it does restore $9 million worth of scholarships, $6 million for the governor's scholarship program, which provides scholarships for students who are New Hampshire scholars and attend a New Hampshire-based post-secondary institution. It also restores $3 million for the dual and concurrent STEM scholarship program, which allows students to take 2 STEM courses as Running Start, early college, those other dual and concurrent enrollment programs each year for free. So it waives that fee. In terms of the higher ed merger, that's something that we've been hearing a lot about. The governor had proposed merging the community college system board of trustees and the university system board of trustees with the goal of merging both institutions. The Senate chose to fund both institutions separately and maintain separate governance structures through the biennium. So all of that language was gutted, and they are moving forward as they currently are right now. And then finally, the divisive concepts portion, there was an amendment that is now included in the Senate version of the budget, which prohibits public schools from teaching about what are, quote, divisive concepts like systemic racism, sexism, ableism. There are a number of other protected categories in there, but proponents of the amendment say that it does allow for the teaching of the, quote, historical existence of these ideas and subjects. All right, so moving on to school vouchers. So that was sort of the funding, some of the other pieces, and now school vouchers, Senate Bill 130, which has been rolled into the budget. So Senate Bill 130, the statewide voucher bill, was introduced in February as a universal voucher bill. It was amended by the Senate, and it has been at this point rolled into House Bill 2, the budget bill. It funds private religious and homeschool programs through taxpayer funded education freedom accounts, which are known as vouchers for eligible students. So the eligibility requirements are, it's an income eligibility requirement. A family upon application has to have an income of less than 300% of the federal poverty guideline, which last year was about $77,000 for a family of 4. The Senate version does note that the student only has to live up to that income eligibility upon application. It does not apply to them in subsequent years. So one year they could make it, the following year their families could have a $1 million increase in income and would still be eligible for the program. So how it works is that parents or guardians, they sign a contract with the independent scholarship organization, and then they receive vouchers, a voucher in the amount of their state aid. So $3,800 in base aid, and if they qualify for special education differentiated aid or that free reduced lunch aid, English language learner aid, all of those programs, they would get that additional money. We've estimated that the voucher amount would average about $5,130 just based on the income eligibility guidelines. And then there is the scholarship organization is allowed to retain 10% of that in fees, in administrative fees, up to 10%, I should say. The funds could be used for private school tuition, homeschool expenses, transportation, software, internet access, all kinds of other school-related expenses. The list is pretty extensive in terms of what it can include. The Senate did add anti-discrimination protections as well as phase-out grants for school districts. So when a student leaves their public school, the first year, the school district would get half of their state aid. The second year, they would get 25% of their state aid, and then they would no longer get aid. These phase-out grants do expire in 2026, so after 2026, the phase out grants are no longer a thing. If a public school student leaves their school, there are no phase out grants for them. The Senate also added a legislative oversight committee, which really focuses on the impact of state and local school districts. The oversight committee doesn't focus on the scholarship organization, education service providers, or sort of the mechanics of like the financials. None of that. It's really focused on the school district's impact and how they might be able to tweak the language of the law to make the program more efficient. So, going back to the eligibility criteria, because the Senate, the full Senate did tweak this a bit. So students are eligible if they are eligible to enroll in a public elementary or secondary school, meaning that they meet the residency requirements, and they have a household income of less than 300% of the federal poverty guidelines upon application. So that current private school students would be eligible. Current homeschool students would be eligible, and then public school students who would leave their public schools would also be eligible. So we originally estimated that 38% of New Hampshire children would be eligible. It would be difficult to model, but it would likely be higher now that that application, the income eligibility requirement, is only upon application. So it's likely that more students might be eligible than the 38%. But it's hard to sort of track that kind of thing, because you'd have to look at incomes and that kind of thing, which the data isn't always easily available or readily available. So in terms of the total financial impact, we estimate that if half of the existing private school and homeschool students were to enroll and adopt a voucher, it would cost the state about $21.5 million in new state spending. And then if 2 to 3% of current public school students adopted the program, it would cost the state about $3.8 million in phase out grants, and then would cost districts $3.8 million in lost state aid. So it's really, the cost to taxpayers in the first year is about $29.1 million when you add up the new state spending that it would require, which would be taken out of the Education Trust Fund, which is that piggy bank for states' public schools and charter schools, and the lost state aid that school districts would, that taxpayers would have to make up in their tax bills. And I'm seeing a question from Tom Southworth. What about students already in private schools? They are eligible for the vouchers or education freedom accounts. There's nothing that restricts them. There is also nothing in statute right now that prohibits a student who is enrolled in the Education Tax Credit Scholarship Program from also receiving a voucher. So as it stands right now, there will be, students would be able to receive both. So $51.30 in the voucher. This year, I believe the average tax credit scholarship was about, if I remember off the top of my head, somewhere around $2,500. Senator Bradley did say on the Senate floor last week that he would support rulemaking from the Department of Education that would ensure that students couldn't qualify for both. So they would have to choose, but that would be a rulemaking process, not in statute. So if this passes and is signed by the governor, there is a rulemaking process for the Department of Education. And so we'll follow along there to see sort of what those rules will be, if that will shake out. And so another topic that we heard a lot about on the Senate floor, we've had a lot of questions, we've fielded a lot of questions from the public and things like that, is accountability and transparency. And so I wanted just to take a moment to compare the accountability requirements for the scholarship organization between the Education Tax Credit Scholarship Program, as noted in RSA 77G, and Senate Bill 130. So these, according to the statute, the application process is the same for Education Tax Credit Scholarship Program organizations and Senate Bill 130. So it's the same process, but the accountability requirements appear to be very different at this point in the proposal in Senate Bill 130. So ETC program organizations are required to report their total administrative expenses and donations. They're required to ensure that their administrative expenses are, I believe it's quote, reasonable in the RSA. And it has requirements for the reporting. It's very strict in terms of where they get their money, how they're where they're sending it, where are they giving scholarships. They have to note the number of scholarships, the zip code of students, where those students are going to school. There are pretty strict conflict of interest requirements in terms of an ETC organization can't have a financial interest in a private school, for instance, I believe is one of them. And so there are some conflict of interest requirements there. It defines what administrative expenses are. There's an annual review by the Department of Revenue Administration. And there are some what I call sunlight report requirements. So they have to have a report and it has to be a public record. So the DRA publishes every single year their report. You can see every more or less everything. You can see everything that is noted in the RSA. So you can see the number of scholarships, you can see the zip code of where they come from, you can see the schools where they go to, and that kind of thing. With Senate Bill 130, there are none of those requirements. So the statute allows the scholarship organization to retain up to 10% of the voucher amount for administrative expenses, but there's no requirement in reporting what they are and that kind of thing. So it's unclear whether those requirements would be set out in rules, but it's notable that RSA 77G has these requirements, but Senate Bill 130 does not. So we're looking out for there, and that has raised concern of a lot of members of the public. And I mean, speaking of concern, over 7,000 people have opposed this voucher program in public hearings. So in the House, it was HB 20, the Dick Hinch Education Freedom Account Act. In the Senate, Senate Bill 130, there has been overwhelming public opposition to this. In the public hearing, 7,000 people opposed, about 1,600 in support. So there's lopsided opposition there. Public polling, 45% of people disagreed with the idea of vouchers in a UNH Granite State poll. 61% of New Hampshire residents opposed it in a Change Research poll. And then as part of our work, we also sort of look at the media landscape and how letters to the editor, columns, that kind of thing, to track public opinion there. And that has overwhelmingly been against Senate Bill 130. So there has been the most public opposition that I've seen in my 6 years of doing this, even with the last proposal in 2017, 2018, to have 7,000 people come out against it is notable. And so, you know, keeping an eye on that. And in terms of the public reaction, there have been a lot of concerns specifically around folding it into the state budget, because it evades a lot of the scrutiny that a program of this size would typically get as part of the normal legislative process. So if it were to go through the normal legislative process, it would have another committee meeting, it would have another executive session where representatives and senators can really iron out some of the details. HB 20 was retained in the House Education Committee for a number of reasons, for lack of support, and because there were so many technical questions that were really out in the open. Former State Rep David Doherty had noted, he was a part of the legislature in 2017-2018 session, and they worked on their SB 193 for hours, for days, for the entire summer, and there were still so many technical issues with it that they couldn't really iron out. But SB 130 is really evading that close look, and there are quite a few technical questions that still remain. But if it's included in the budget, they won't be answered at this time. So next steps in terms of the entire budget, the Senate passed the budget on June 3rd. The House is scheduled to vote on whether or not it will go to a committee of conference on June 10th. And the committee of conference, I've read in the press and everything that a committee of conference is likely. We expect it to go there. We don't expect the House to put their stamp of approval on it on Thursday. So if they do move to a committee of conference, it will they have a deadline of June 17th. And the members aren't public yet that I've seen. If anyone here knows, I would love to know. So I would love it if you threw it in the chat. By the House rules, Representative Ken Weiler, who serves as the chair of the House Finance Committee, will chair the the section of the Committee of Conference. And so I put his email there in case anyone's interested. He's the only person I know at this point who would be on it, or he might designate someone. And then the governor has also had a pretty heavy hand in guiding the budget process. So his email is there as well. If you have thoughts, want to get in contact with him, then that's his information. And just, in closing, before we go to questions, we would love to welcome Kayla Provencher, who has been an intern with Reaching Higher since last summer. And she just recently moved into the public policy researcher position. So she is a staff member here at Reaching Higher. We are so excited to have her on. She's on here today on this meeting. So love you, Kayla. Thank you. And then Hannah Harding, who is a UNH rising senior. She is with us for the summer as an intern. We are very excited to have her on board as well. So welcome, Hannah. Love to have you along. Also a reminder, this is an open meeting, and if you would like to join the New Hampshire Education Network, we can drop a link in the chat in order for you to register. We do send out emails like when I hear something or that kind of thing, and then we have these monthly meetings. Which brings me to the next point. There is no meeting in July, so we hope everyone has a great summer. There's a survey going around. You probably got it last month of what other topics would you like to see covered? How would you like to stay involved? And is there any services that we can offer to you? We'd love to do that. Let us know. Drop us an email. My email is Christina@reachinghigher.newhampshire.org. And there we have all of the other ones at the end. And then as a final announcement, this event is not sponsored by or affiliated with Reaching Higher New Hampshire, but a panel with the authors of A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door is happening tomorrow at 6:30. And I've read the book. I know a lot of other people have read the book. It talks a lot about the national school voucher movement, other efforts to dismantle public education. And I'd highly recommend it as a read, but the authors are going to be here in New Hampshire tomorrow, and we can drop that link in the chat as well if you'd like to. And again, not sponsored by or affiliated with Reaching Higher, but it was a great book. So now we can, open it up to questions if anyone has them.
Great. So we had one question in the chat or actually two, I believe. Both from Teresa. So I can give her first question was explaining the never mind, then I can't answer the anti-discrimination protection. And I think she had another question about a town like Bow being affected by the vouchers, either directly or indirectly. So Christina, would you feel comfortable sort of addressing, can you explain the anti-discrimination protection in the voucher bill, please?
Yeah, sure. So the current version of the voucher statute states that education service providers must adhere to all state and federal anti-discrimination laws, which has pretty significant impacts in terms of their compliance with ADA, IDEA, all of these other things, all of these other both federal and state anti-discrimination laws. So it does extend those provisions. I would note, I am not a lawyer. However, in other states that have similar language, there are religious exemptions from things like Title IX that deals with, you know, gender identity, gender, all of those kinds of sexual orientation, those kinds of things for LGBTQ plus students and families. And there may be religious exemptions there that serve as a loophole is a bad term for this, but that could impact those laws as well. But the anti-discrimination laws do extend as part of this latest version of SB 130.
And the other part of her question was, why would a town like Bow be affected by the vouchers either directly or indirectly?
Sure. So by our financial analysis, a place like Bow would really be affected largely by if students leave their public schools for a voucher, to enroll in the voucher program, because in order to receive a voucher, you have to withdraw full-time from your public school. And so with that, Bow would lose their state funding, and where it's 2 to 3% projected, that isn't usually. We've heard from school administrators, from school boards, that a loss of 50 kids in a 500 or 1,000 person school, it's not concentrated. Like, you're not losing an entire second grade class, so you're not going to reassign a second grade teacher and see savings that way. It's typically spread out, and so you're losing that state aid, but you're not able to cut programming, you're not able to cut staffing, and so your taxpayers have to make up for that lost state aid.
That's a great explanation. You might want to go back to the houses, because Leslie has a question. Still not understanding the change in the swept amounts, and she was hoping for another stab at that. Swept is wildly confusing, right down to whether when you're looking at data, do you consider swept a state or a local tax? It has all kind of nuance to it. So completely understand why it's not the easiest concept to grasp. I struggle mightily.
Yeah, sure. So, all right. So sorry, I'm seeing the question. I still don't. Okay. So, swept by a per statute, the statewide education property tax, that line on your property tax bill, has to raise a total of $363 million per year. And so the state takes all of the property valuation, comes up with a calculation, comes up with their magic with a tax rate. Next year, it's going to be $1.83 per $1,000. So that's the state education property tax rate. The Senate, in order to give all residents a property tax cut, lowered that threshold from $363 million to $263 million, which effectively lowered the tax rate from $1.83 to $1.33. So where you would normally see before all of the DRA is just a black box to me. There's a lot of stuff they do. So you would normally see, like, on your property tax bill, you'd see $1.83. With this $100 million swept reduction, you'll see $1.33 approximately. And again, these are estimated numbers, since property valuations for 2023 aren't out yet, I believe. So these are the $1.83 and the $1.33 are, I think at this point, like, discussion purposes, but this is affected. It's a 27% drop in that rate, and it's across the board. So people in Moulton Borough are getting a 27% reduction in their state education property tax. Charlestown is getting a 27% reduction in their state property tax. And where this becomes significant is when we look at the median home values in these towns. So in Charlestown, the median home value, according to Zillow, is $182,000. In Moulton Borough, it's $513,000. So using that property tax rate, a Charlestown resident's property tax is going down $92. In Moulton Borough, it's going down $257. And so when we think about targeting aid, this is a less targeted way to provide aid. Okay, why does Moulton Borough get $1.8 million? So Moulton Borough gets $1.8 million because so that $1.83. Okay, so let's sorry, I'm going to try to explain this using very inaccurate numbers, but maybe I hope it will help. So a $1.83 tax rate, Moulton Borough would raise, say, $5 million from that $1.83. They raise $5 million from it, and with the $1.33 tax cut, that they now only raise $3.2 million. And so the state is making up for that difference because Moulton Borough keeps all of their swept because they don't, they raise more than their adequate education grant. So they would say they would receive $1 million if from the DOE, but they raise $5 million in swept. So there's that $4 million gap. They're raising $4 million from swept than they need to, but they keep that money. Even though it's a state tax, they keep that money in their own community. They can do with it, from my understanding, they can offset their property taxes, they can infuse it in their schools, whatever it is. So that $4 million, since the property tax rate cuts it by $1.8 million, the state said, okay, well, since this property tax cut means that you lost that $4 million, that there's that $4 million gap, it eats into that excess swept. We're going to pay you for that as a supplemental payment to bring you back up to what that excess swept was. I don't think that was helpful. I'm sorry.
I think it is very helpful. And I'll add one more thing. The reason Charlestown and Derry do not get a supplemental payment is because they never raise what they need through their property taxes. So there's no gap to make up from the state, because as far as the state is concerned, they're not losing any money.
Right. Yes, that is a great way to put it. Yes, thank you, Sarah.
So that's why you don't see any supplemental payment there, but you do in Moulton Borough, because the state is like, well, we would never want to take money away from you. Of course, we're going to make up that gap for you. So yeah, it's an interesting way to attack school funding. Lois Cody has a question. Is there any way to get rid of HB 130 as amended into the budget bill other than the governor's veto?
That would be, at this point, the avenue for that is through the committee of conference. If it does go to a committee of conference, those legislators can talk about things that are in either the House or Senate proposal. So since Senate Bill 130 is in the Senate proposal, it is fair game. And I will note that the vote among the committee of conference has to be unanimous. If it is not unanimous, the bill doesn't go forward. The budget will not go forward. So all members of that committee of conference, the senators and the House members, have to be on board with what's in the budget. And so at this point, any of those dealings would be done by by the committee of conference members. And we should know who those people are, hopefully by the end of the week. By Thursday for sure, maybe sooner.
That's great. Julie King just jumped in with a question. It's my understanding that SWEPT is kept locally. Yes, that is correct. It never goes back to Concord. It's never redistributed. It's the same amount for every single community, and whatever is made off of that amount stays within the community. Does it make sense then that in property poor towns, a cut to the SWEPT tax really isn't a cut, since it will mean higher local tax rates to cover the cost of education?
So the tax rate, that tax will be made up from the education trust fund. So the state will give whatever that difference is from the they'll see that in their aid from the state. So in Charlestown, if that SWEPT tax brings it down $1 million, they're getting an extra $1 million from the education trust fund. Not extra, because there's no, it's not extra. It's just that it's being made up in a different way. Instead of relying on local property taxpayers to raise that money, it's coming from the education trust fund, and that's funneling that in.
So just spying the time, we're at 3:56. If anyone has any other questions, this has been a great dive into the budget, Christina. This is awesome. You've answered so many of my questions around what's going on. I'm so grateful I can so heavily rely on your expertise to feel informed. Would you mind throwing up our contact information while we've got the last couple of minutes? Just reminding folks that you can reach out to us whenever about whatever. If it's education related, we would love to be in contact with you. Thanks again to Nicole for throwing in. If you scroll up through your chat, you'll see a link to tomorrow's event around that novel, The Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door. And if you scroll up a bit higher, previous to our gathering norms, you'll also see a link to the form that you can use to apply for the network. What's the link that you just threw in there, Christina?
That was the link to this Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door.
Oh, thanks so much. That's awesome. So here's all of our contact information. I am the steward of the network. So if you have questions about the network at all, you can reach out to me directly. Any last questions before we say thank you and release everyone into this ridiculous heat? You're very welcome, Leslie. Thank you so much for being here. And if anybody has a question, if you want to raise your hand, you don't need to type everything into the chat. I know that can be a bit cumbersome when you just have something you need to ask. But I'm not seeing any takers on that. In that case, we're ending very much on time. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, we will not be having a network meeting in July. We're going to give everybody a break, and you can look forward to seeing us in August. So you'll see a cancellation come through for our July for those who have registered. And then you can just, join us in August, and we're really looking forward to seeing you then. Hope you all have a great July and the rest of June. Thanks for being with us. Thanks, team.
Thank you.
Are we staying on?
I'm going to end the meeting for everyone. Thanks. Bye.